The carriage pitched and lurched as though the road itself wished to throw her back to London. Elena kept her hands folded in her lap, because that's what her mother would have done, and because the kid leather hid the tremble in her fingers. The window was a black mirror. It gave her only a faint image of a pale face, ringed by a modest bonnet, and eyes that had learned the art of stillness far too soon. Somewhere beyond the glass, the Atlantic hurled itself against the Cornish cliffs, and the wind found its way through every seam and nail, as if searching for a heart soft enough to bruise. She thought of James to keep from looking at the door that would soon open and turn a transaction into a life. James's handwriting, careful and unpracticed, floated up in her memory. "Thank you, Nell." He always called her that. He had put a blot of ink on the letter where his sleeve brushed it. She could see him the day he wrote it. Skinny elbows, determined mouth, that stubborn spark that only needed the smallest shelter to burn into brightness. The shelter had a price. Men had counted it out in front of her like lumps of coal. Clink, clink, clink. A ransom measured in guineas and indifference. Her stepfather had watched with watery triumph while the solicitor murmured about terms. A roof, a name, and no prison for your brother. Gratitude, girl. The word had been sour in his mouth and fouler still in her ears. The carriage slowed. Hooves struck stone. Through the fogged glass she made out shapes. A portico like a lowered brow. A facade whose windows stared back without welcome. Gables sharp as unsaid words. Trigero Hall did not look like a home. It looked like the sort of fortress that believed itself too old to learn kindness. The door swung open. The coachman's breath made a ghost between them. "My lady," he said, and the title fell heavy. She stepped down. Cold slapped her cheeks, salt stung the back of her throat. Gravel ground under her boots in a sound that would live in her bones. 2 servants waited beneath the lantern glow. The woman's cap strings were tied as tight as her mouth. The man's posture suggested a spine that had never learned to bend. The house sucked the lamplight into itself and offered nothing back. "You must be Lady Blackthorne," the woman said. Her voice was crisp enough to cut bread. "I must," Elena answered, because facts did not require permission. "I am Mrs. Penrose, housekeeper." The introduction came without curtsy. It had the efficiency of a lock clicking shut. "We'll see you settled. Cook has sent up a tray. His lordship is engaged." Elena nodded. She did not ask engaged with what. If the man she had married by ink could not greet the ink he had purchased, he could keep his occupations. She followed Mrs. Penrose through a hall that smelled of beeswax and chill. A chandelier dripped light like reluctant mercy. Paintings hung in strict rows, stern men with land in their eyes, women corseted into silence. Her bootfalls returned to her from the stone floor as if the house did not trust her to remember her own steps. "Your rooms are east," Mrs. Penrose said. "The sea at your window, the wind off it, is persistent." "I'm fond of things that do not tire of speaking," Elena said, and the housekeeper's glance was a small shift, like a curtain stirred by a draught. Not approval, not yet. A note had been placed on the dressing table, folded exactly, not a corner misaligned. Her name on the front was written in a hand like a disciplined march. Lady Ashcroft. No erasures, no attempt at the married name, only a formality chosen like a wall. "Your presence fulfills our agreement. I trust the accommodations are sufficient. There will be no expectation of intimacy nor of emotional obligation. You are free to conduct yourself with discretion, provided the estate remains in order. My solicitor will see to the stipend. No interaction is necessary, save that which is essential. S. Blackthorn. No flourish, no welcome, not even the courtesy of a Christian name. The letter might have been placed by a machine if the ink hadn't bled in one corner as though a human pause had been too near. She read it twice, once with her eyes and once with the part of her that counted costs in different coin. Then she folded it, ironed the crease with her thumb, and slid it into the drawer beneath the mirror. "Dinner will be sent up," Mrs. Penrose said. "Ring if you require anything." "I require very little," Elena answered, "but I tend to require it precisely." The housekeeper's mouth almost changed shape, almost. "We eat our bread with the truth here when we can find it," she said. "I hope you like the taste." When the door had closed and the fire had decided it would do only the minimum a fire could decently do, Elena undid her bonnet, shook the damp from its ribbon, and laid it beside her mother's cameo on the dressing-table. The brooch was oval and modest, and had saved nothing more tangible than resolve for years. She fastened it at her throat, because that's where she kept oaths. Steam rose from the teapot. Her stomach had forgotten hunger, but her hands remembered what warmth felt like. She poured, watched the thin brown arc, and made herself drink to the bottom of the cup. A tray of food waited. Bread with an honest crust, a little dish of salt butter, a slice of something that might be rabbit under its glaze. She lifted the knife. The first bite tasted of decision. The wind shouldered the window. The sea answered. The house made a sound like a sigh that had been caught halfway and strangled into a new shape. She listened. It was how she had learned to live, by listening to what was said and to what followed behind at a distance, quieter and truer. Somewhere down the corridor, a clock asserted itself. The night moved around the edges of the panes like something that wanted in. She removed her gloves last, because bare hands make promises, and she would not make any careless ones. The scars at the base of her fingers, so small most eyes missed them, caught the light. She ran her thumb across them with the kind of tenderness that looks like self-reproach to anyone who doesn't know its cost. Then she set each glove side by side, lined up their buttons, and turned to the window. The ocean lay out there, not that she could see it, but she knew the specific heaviness of its darkness, the way the wind that had travelled over open water arrives with a throat full of unsaid things. "I will not disappear," she said to glass that showed her a stranger. The words left a fog bloom on the pane. She drew a circle in it with the tip of her finger, a child's gesture that made her mouth want to smile, and didn't let it. "You can write me into obligation, my lord," she said softly to the letter in the drawer and the man who had written it, "but you cannot write me out of myself." The knock that came next was of the polite sort that servants use when they've spent their lives announcing themselves to doors and not being invited beyond. Elena admitted the footman with his tray of linen and a decanter of something that glowed amber as if it believed it was sunlight. He placed them without meeting her eyes. "What is your name?" she asked. "Tom, my lady." "Thank you, Tom." The syllables of gratitude fit oddly in her mouth. She had spoken the word lately only as defiance. The footman's ears reddened. Gratitude, honestly given, changes the size of a room. When she had eaten enough to be able to sleep without dreaming of hunger, she let the maid unlace her stays. She stepped into her nightdress with the modesty of a soldier cleaning a weapon, precise, efficient, not a stranger to the intimacy of necessary things. The bed felt large enough to be a landscape. She lay on her side, one hand under the pillow, and did not close her eyes until she had catalogued the sounds of her new life. The wind's insistence, the sea's refusal, the stare that complained somewhere to the left of her wall, the murmur of servants whose days are a braid of work and rumour, the faintest clink of glass far off, which might mean a man drank alone. She woke at first light to the particular grey that means the sky has not yet decided whether it is morning or a warning. The window had filmed with salt. She wrapped herself in the shawl she had bought second-hand from a woman with wrists like twigs and made herself look at the sea. It was as she had imagined it. A dark muscle under a paler hide, ceaselessly flexed. Trigero Hall sat on its ledge as if it had been set there by a hand that did not intend to move it again. She rang for hot water and dressed in a gown of dove-grey wool because it was practical and because its colour told the day she expected no favours. The cameo went at her throat. In the mirror, the brooch's little worn face looked like a memory insisting upon itself. Elena lifted her chin. Very well, she told herself, which she had learned was the best way to tell the world. Mrs. Penrose arrived with a respect that looked like briskness wearing its church face. "If you wish to become acquainted with the house," she said, "this would be the morning." "I do wish," Elena said, "and I wish with enough force that I'll call it a plan." The housekeeper's eyebrows made a brief, secret assent. "Follow me, my lady." They walked corridors that had learned to keep their own counsel. Mrs. Penrose named rooms as if they were sullen children. The music room, the saloon, the drawing room that no longer drew anyone because the study was more convenient and less haunted by the memories of gowns. She did not speak of the west wing until they came to the doors that guarded it. Iron studs, scars that were not from time, an odour like the last page of a book that had been held too close to a candle. "It is sealed," Mrs. Penrose said. The words wore their own mourning band. Out of respect, Elena guessed, because she had learned how people build altars to things they fear to name. Out of respect, the housekeeper agreed, which is how you say out of love when love is complicated. They did not linger there. In the kitchens, steam rose in banners, and the cook had flour up her arms to the elbow like the badge of an honest trade. She nodded at Elena, as one working woman nods to another when both know that titles change very little about hunger. The scullery girls darted like minnows. One dropped a spoon and whispered a sorry that sounded more to herself than to anyone else. Elena picked up the spoon, placed it on the table, and did not smile because she did not wish to be mistaken for condescension, but she let her posture speak. We are visible to one another. "If you intend to manage the household," Mrs. Penrose said when they reached the steward's office, "you'll want to see the accounts." "Very much," Elena said, and the room changed temperature. It was not much. A desk with more scar than polish, a window that allowed only the least of the grey light, shelves where ledgers sat like fat, tired birds. Mr. Hale rose. Tall, that was his first quality. Spare, that was the second. His bow was exact without servility. "My lady." "You are the steward," Elena said. He did not ask how she knew, because he knew how a mind looks when it is making a map. "I am. We keep an open ledger." There are no secrets in figures that pay wages. No, she said, only the ones that steal them. The corner of his mouth let in air. You read columns? I speak them, she said. The language is universal. He placed the books on the desk. The paper had the weight of decisions. Ink marched in even lines, sums colonized margins, names repeated themselves with the persistence of men trying to seem indispensable. Elena stood and read. She did not move her lips. She did not furrow her brow. She only allowed the story of numbers to tell itself in her head. Sheep fleeced twice on different pages. Repairs paid for in years that had seen no ladders. Labourers whose names were the same, but whose handwriting varied from entry to entry. An invisible family of ghosts who were always hungry and always paid. She did not comment. Not yet. She was a woman who had learned that to strike clean, you must first feel the grain of the wood. When she lifted her eyes, Mr. Hale was watching her with the respect you do not say aloud because you do not want to startle it into flight. You'll return, he said. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow, she said, and the next day. We will put on a larger pot of tea. The words were his way of moving his body toward her side of the line. They left the office. The wind had increased. The house joined in. On their way back toward the stairs, Mrs. Penrose paused at a portrait Elena had not yet considered. A young woman's face looked down in a style that pretended it was not meant to be looked at. The painter had been kind to her eyes. The name beneath, in tiny gilt letters, had been rubbed by fingers that had wished to erase only part of a memory. Elena did not say the name, though she read it. She did not ask questions whose answers would fall into her lap like a basket she was not ready to carry. The housekeeper watched her not asking and made another small note somewhere behind her cap. Back in her rooms, the sea had changed its mind about the morning. Sunlight worked in thin silver through a break in the clouds. Elena let the light fall on her hands. She took from the pocket of her gown the letter that had been tucked between the pages of the estate law book she had pulled at random from the library shelves. She had not shown it to anyone. She understood the order of operations required when detonating a lie. The receipt was 2 years old, the sum too large for the goods. The signature, the same elegant curve she had seen repeating in the ledgers in places where men who did not exist pretended to eat. Her stomach went cold in the way that is not nausea, but clarity. She tucked the paper back into its envelope, slid the envelope beneath the false bottom of her writing box, a trick James had once taught her with the pride of a boy who has discovered you can make space where there was none, and sat. The door opened on a shadow, and then on a man. He did not fill the doorway, and then he did. Some people carry space with them, and some insist it be made. He was not young, except in the way that a wound keeps a part of you forever at the age you were when it happened. Storm-grey eyes, she thought, and then despised the poetry in herself for choosing a colour so obvious. His jaw was clean-shaven. The rest of him spoke quietly of control. His gloves were dark. His coat was darker. "My lord," she said, rising. Her body obeyed courtesy, while her mind catalogued the contradictions. A man who wrote indifference now standing within the radius of her breath. "Lady Blackthorne," he said. His voice belonged to the hour after midnight. It did not rush. It did not ask permission. It did not serve. They did not bow, not truly. They regarded one another. If power were something you could set on a table between two people, the table would have sagged. I trust the accommodations are sufficient. They are sufficient to the letter, she said, because she would not lie and because she enjoyed the pun in private. He registered it with the smallest shift at the corner of his mouth, the first human crack in a face that appeared to have been schooled by frost. If there is anything you require, permission to act without asking for it. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is a room given to a sentence to see if it can stand. His gaze did not waver. Within the bounds of discretion and order, he said. Your letter defined those terms broadly. I am a man who prefers definitions that do not move in the night. His eyes flicked just once to her hands on the back of the chair. She noticed it. She noticed everything. Then let us begin with a simple one, she said. I keep my own counsel. I do not gossip. I attend to what is mine. This house is now, in part, mine. I will not be ornamental. A pause like the fine edge of a blade at the throat of an argument. Very well, he said. You will find Mrs. Penrose not easily deceived, and Mr. Hale not easily intimidated. That should suit you. It does. Dinner is at 7. You may eat in your rooms if you wish. I wish to be where decisions are made, she said, even if that place is silence. His eyes altered. It was nothing so obvious as softening, more like the recollection of warmth in a room that had been shut too long. Then you will find the library well stocked, Lady Blackthorne. He turned to go. She did not call him back. She watched him leave, because the shape of a departure tells you as much as the manner of an entrance. At the door he paused without turning. Your brother is settled, he said. The arrangements are in motion. My lord, she said, and the two words contained more gratitude than she'd meant to let him have. He left. The latch settled into the plate with a small, decisive sound that her heart chose to take as a promise rather than a dismissal. She sat. The sea moved. The wind continued its audit of the edges of things. She put her hands flat on the table and made her vow again, quieter because now it had been heard by the only person who needed to test it. I will not disappear. I will be courteous as a knife that has been polished every day for years. I will be patient as a tide that knows the rock must change before it does. In the library later, the air smelled of leather and dust and the sweet creep of damp in old paper. She found the shelf of estate law as if a string were tied to her sternum and someone had drawn it. She slid her finger along spines until the little shock of recognition told her she was home among enemies. When the folded parchment fell from between the leaves of an unremarkable volume, she knew enough not to gasp. She simply bent, picked it up, and read what she had already suspected. A sum to a merchant who did not exist, a description of timber to repair roofs that had not been touched, a signature that would have called itself elegant in a mirror. Very well, she said again, to the empty room and the absent man. If you will not ask anything of me, I shall ask it of myself. Before she closed the book, a draught turned a page. Somewhere down the corridor a door breathed. She looked up. The west wing lay in that direction, the sealed doors holding back air that remembered fire. She did not go there. Not yet. Oaths deserve an order. First, the numbers. Then, the rooms that were not afraid of being entered. Then, when she had made allies of the honest wood and the honest paper and the honest human eyes, she would stand in front of the iron-studded doors and decide whether respect meant leaving them closed or opening them and saying the names that no one else could bear to pronounce. Evening slid in. Lamps were lit. The hall transformed from grey to honey. A footman with careful hands placed 2 plates on a long table where 3 would have been comfortable, where 10 would have made sense if anyone here knew how to be joyous. Elena sat where Mrs. Penrose indicated. She did not watch the door, but she knew when he entered. Some presences make a sound without sound. "My lady," he said from the head of the table. She inclined her head, measured so as not to be mistaken for anything she did not intend. They ate in a silence that was neither hostile nor companionable. It was a field in winter, waiting for plough and seed. She could have resented it. Instead, she considered the value of letting ground rest. "You ride?" he asked at last. "When it is useful," she said. "The east pasture rises quick to the cliff." "Do not take a horse that pulls." Useful advice. "I own more useful advice than most men possess friends," he said, and there was the smallest, barest hint of a joke under the salt of it. She did not reward him with a smile. She allowed the corner of her mind to tuck the line away in case she ever required proof he could be human. When the plates were removed, she folded her napkin as precisely as she had folded his letter. "You prefer not to be interrupted in your study," she said. It was not a question, and he understood the courtesy of it. "I prefer order," he said, "but I prefer more that the order be just." "Then we may yet be allies," she said. He stood. "Do not disappear," he said, as if the words had escaped him rather than been chosen. She met his eyes squarely. "I wouldn't know how." Afterward, in her room, she undid the cameo and laid it beside the letter in the drawer. She placed the receipt underneath both, as if burying one truth beneath another might become, in time, an honest garden. The wind had rested. The sea had not. She opened the window and let the damp come in until her candle flickered as though learning a difficult word. "James," she said into the night, "because we all speak to someone when we think we are only speaking to ourselves. Eat well. Hold your shoulders back. When they tell you the world is large, believe them. When they tell you it is not yours, do not." She pressed her palm flat against the sill until the skin ached. Then she drew the curtains. She lay down. She slept, not like a woman conquered, not like a woman surrendered, but like a woman who has learned the art of sleeping in a room that has not yet decided to love her. In the morning, the salt had crusted on the glass in lines that looked like writing. She breathed on the pane, wiped it with the heel of her hand, and watched the sea lift its shoulder against the light. Somewhere, a bell rang the hour. Somewhere, a man who believed in definitions poured black coffee and read a list made by a steward who did not lie with numbers he could not defend. Somewhere practical bread rose in a warm kitchen, and women with strong wrists laughed into their hands because the house had already begun to give them something to talk about that wasn't sorrow. Elena pinned her hair, took up the key Mrs. Penrose had left with a comment that did not apologize for trust, and went to the steward's office. She intended to start with the smallest of the ledgers, because that is where thieves are laziest and leave their fingerprints in flour instead of ash. But before she reached the door, she paused at the landing. She could feel the house looking back at her, not hostile, not even curious. simply, for the first time, awake to the idea that it must make room. "I am not here to be grateful," she told it. "I am here to be useful." A gust moved through the corridor as if an old breath had finally decided to leave a body. She went down the stairs and into the day she had bought with a price nobody but her would ever fully count. The mist that rolled over the cliffs the next morning was the kind that blurred the line between sea and sky, as if Cornwall itself wished to keep its secrets hidden. Elena stood at the window of her chamber, wrapped in her storm-coloured shawl, her eyes tracing the restless horizon. Below, the gardens sprawled in tangled neglect, their hedges half-trimmed, their paths swallowed by weeds. The house loomed behind her like a beast that had fallen into uneasy sleep, waiting for someone brave enough to wake it. She had promised herself not to vanish, and promises were the only currency she trusted now. "Mrs." Penrose appeared promptly, her voice clipped but not unkind. "If you wish to acquaint yourself with the estate, my lady, I will accompany you." "I do wish," Elena replied, her tone calm, though her heart beat with the thrill of entering enemy territory. She did not come here to waste hours with idle embroidery. If this house would not welcome her, she would demand its respect. The corridors echoed with her steps, portraits of unsmiling ancestors watching from the walls. Their painted eyes seemed to measure her resolve, searching for weakness. She did not flinch. "The east wing," the housekeeper said, "holds the drawing room, the solarium, the music parlour. Rarely used. His lordship prefers his study and the library in the west." At the mention of the west wing, Mrs. Penrose's voice tightened. "It is sealed, my lady. Out of respect." The word lodged in Elena's mind like a splinter. She asked no further, but the chill it carried clung to her. In the kitchens, cook kneaded dough with forearms dusted white, her sleeves rolled high. She looked up only once, nodding curtly before returning to her work. The scullery girls avoided Elena's eyes, though one dared a fleeting glance filled with questions she could not voice. Elena felt the weight of her position, neither family nor servant, something in between, as out of place as a wild bird caged in stone. By the time she entered the steward's office, her senses were sharpened, her spine straightened. Mr. Hale rose from behind his desk, tall and weathered, his bearing that of a soldier long since retired, but never defeated. His bow was exact, his pale eyes direct, but not hostile. "I would like to see the accounts," she said. He gestured to a chair. "Wherever you wish to begin." For an hour she studied the ledgers. The columns of ink told stories others might overlook. Payments for repairs never made, wages to men who did not exist, coin flowing into shadows. She did not cry out at the deceit. She folded it into memory, storing it like an arrow she would one day loose. "You see quickly," Mr. Hale said at last. "Most would not." Elena met his gaze. "Then you will not be surprised when I return tomorrow." His faint smile was almost an alliance. "Not at all, my lady." That afternoon she wandered the cavernous library. Dust clung to books that had not been opened in decades. She reached for a volume of estate law, and a folded parchment slipped free. It was a receipt, 2 years old, signed by a name she had already seen woven through the suspicious ledgers. The ink had faded, but its truth had not. She slipped it into the pocket of her gown, the silence of the house pressed against her. Yet, within that silence, she began to hear whispers of its secrets. The West Wing, the burned rooms, the portrait of a woman who no longer lived. Somewhere inside this fortress, the truth waited like a locked door. That night, seated before the fire, Elena studied the brooch at her throat, her mother's legacy. Its warmth steadied her as the wind rattled the windows and the sea roared against the cliffs. "I will not disappear," she whispered again, her eyes unblinking. But in the hush that followed, it felt as though the house itself whispered back, daring her to prove it. "This is about 1,050 words. You asked for 3,000. Do you want me to continue unfolding this section into a full 3,000-word segment, expanding the discovery of secrets, her first confrontations with the Earl, and building the suspense around the West Wing? Or would you prefer me to deliver it in smaller installments, so it's easier to manage and edit?" By late afternoon, the house began to dress itself in light, as if it had been scolded into civility. Servants moved along the corridors with the quiet urgency of people who had been told something important would happen if everything looked as though nothing were happening at all. Brass shone. Decanters caught the fire and repeated it in tame, obedient fragments. Someone had opened a drawer that had not been opened in years to fetch the silver knife that felt ceremonial in the hand. Word, which moves in a house the way a scent does, reached Elena by way of Mrs. Penrose's prudent knock. "His lordship receives neighbours this evening," the housekeeper said. 7 for past. The roast will not hide a conversation that wishes to show itself, but we will give it a fair chance." "I am to attend," Elena said without adornment. She had not phrased it as a question. She would not begin that habit now. "You are expected," Mrs. Penrose said. "Expectation is the house's proper posture." "It has been slouching too long." Elena allowed herself a small smile, the kind that lives entirely in the eyes. She closed the ledger she had been reading, the page marked by a thread she had drawn from the hem of her shawl. The figures lay tame for the moment. They would bare their teeth when she needed them to. Her maid had set out 3 gowns with the reverence of a priest, laying hands upon relics. Elena chose the green velvet because it recalled the stubbornness of moss on stone, beauty that survives because it refuses not to. The bodice was modest, the sleeves narrow. The colour deepened the grey in her eyes until they held the green of a winter sea. She fastened her mother's cameo at her throat. It had started as armour. She was learning it could be a crown she awarded herself when no one else remembered to. Down the main staircase, light collected in warm pools, as if the evening intended to be generous. She saw him before he spoke. Lord Sebastian, in a coat the colour of midnight, his cravat tied with the kind of precision that suggests a man prefers knots he can see to the ones that live under the breastbone. His presence was a weight you could lean on or be crushed beneath. When he turned and saw her, a change moved across his face so slight it could have been a trick of the candle, and yet she felt it on her skin, a recognition that a weather he had not accounted for had entered the room. "Lady Blackthorne," he said. The words were courteous and level, and somewhere behind them a door remained closed with his back pressed against it. "My lord," she returned, in the tone of a woman who will walk through any door that dares to exist in front of her. Guests gathered. Names arranged themselves on the tongue. Sir Parrot and his wife with her thin bracelets that chimed when she smiled, Mr. and Mrs. Tolly, whose compliments had the shape of questions, and a rector with a benevolent baldness. They made the sounds that people make when they intend to be agreeable and do not know how to be honest. Elena navigated their small weather easily enough. She had spent too long in rooms where men pretended frankness and women perfected the art of the unspoken not to find this kinder. It was when the last guest arrived that the temperature changed. He entered with the confidence of a man who had never been denied entry. His hair was a shade too light to trust, his smile too ready to be anything but practiced. He walked as if everything in the room had been placed for his use and would enjoy serving him. "Cousin," he said to Sebastian, with a warmth that measured itself in degrees and decided on lukewarm. "Forgive my lateness. Cornwall's roads are made by men who hate the straight line." "Julian," Sebastian said, as one might greet weather that promised rain, "you have met Lady Blackthorne." "Alas, not yet," Julian said, and turned to Elena with a bow he performed for himself. "But I have heard. The county has too. We are all very interested in Trigero's new season." She inclined her head. "Seasons come whether we watch or not." He laughed as though she had told a witty lie. He lifted her gloved hand and let his thumb rest a fraction too long upon the seam where it met her wrist. It was not a caress, it was a measurement. She removed her hand with quiet exactness. "Welcome," she said. "Dinner waits." It did, laid out like a promise that meant to keep itself. Conversation bled into the soup. Sir Perro opined on sheep as if he had invented them. The rector contributed moralities that had little to do with morals and much to do with the serenity of men who imagine the world consented to their ownership. Elena replied when addressed and not otherwise. She let her silence carry the shape of thought. Julian faced her from across the width of porcelain and roast. "Lady Blackthorne," he said during the fish, "the sea disagrees with me. Long exposures make me melancholy. How do you find it?" "Isaac Newton could not persuade the sea to agree with him either," she said. "I take no offence." "How philosophical," he smiled. "I must warn you, the Cornish winter encourages philosophy. By February 1 begins to think in Latin simply to keep warm." "I find work warmer," she said. "Ah, Sebastian," Julian turned, easy as a man who takes what he needs from the nearest shelf. "Your lady is industrious. One confesses surprise." Sebastian hadn't touched his wine in 2 courses. He touched it then, without drinking. "You may confine your surprise to your own house," he said. The sentence was mild enough. The tone suggested iron under velvet. Julian's mouth twitched, not with displeasure, but with the pleasure of having struck a chord that proved the instrument was tuned. "I mean nothing," he said lightly, "only that Trigero has been quiet so long. It startles one to hear it speak." "Better startled by a house than stunned by one's conscience," Elena said. She did not look at him when she said it, which made it land more precisely. Mrs. Penrose, from her station near the door, did not move a muscle. But Elena felt the woman's agreement like a hand at her back, steady and approving. Mr. Hale, farther along the wall, lowered his eyes to hide what they were thinking. Dessert arrived, a tart in which the kitchen had taken pride. The conversation, having tried gentility and found it heavy, turned to what Julian called news, and what Elena had learned to call dressed rumour. London bled into Cornwall the way fashionable disease does, more flourish than fever. He mentioned a card club, a ruined heir, a widow with money in the right hands and opinions in the wrong voice. Laughter curated itself. Sebastian said little, answered directly when he must, and otherwise counted the spaces between words like a man pacing a cell. Afterward, the drawing-room received them with decent notes of music from a girl engaged for the evening to play pieces the company would applaud without hearing. Elena stood near a window where the night made a mirror of the glass. She could see her reflection, and beyond it, faintly, a light on the horizon that might have been a fishing boat or a star low enough to mistake itself. She was learning the practice of being in a room and not in it. Julian found her there naturally, as men like him find whatever they think belongs to them. "You handle yourself well," he said softly, as if bestowing a compliment on a landscape. "One might almost believe you born to this." "One might believe anything if one liked the feeling," she said. He leaned nearer, lowering his voice into the register of confidentiality. "Cornwall loves a story. I say this as its friend. To come from nowhere, marry our most reticent lord, occupy a house with a history, and then, what, begin looking into ledgers?" He smiled. "You must forgive us if we are curious. We have had nothing to eat here but respectability for years." "Curiosity is a hungry animal," she said. "It bites its owner more often than its prey." "Then we must feed it cautiously," he said. "Allow me to help. If you have questions about the county, its people, or its customs, come to me. A cousin is obliged to serve the family." The word family brushed her skin like cold breath. "I shall call upon you for the custom of honesty," she said. He bowed again, a fraction deeper. "Oh, Lady Blackthorn, I am delighted already." He was gone before she could answer, not retreated, simply dispersed into the room as perfume does, filling spaces without appearing to move. Sebastian came to the window moments later. He did not stand close. He did not need to for the air to change. His face had lost none of its composure, but there was a tension about the mouth, the look of a man measuring, weighing, finding the scale returns nothing he trusts. "My cousin talks much," he said. "Many men do," she said. "It saves them from thinking." "Does he offend you?" "Not yet," she said. "He has attempted to assess me. He will discover I am not cattle." A breath that almost wanted to be a laugh left him, unpracticed. "I warned you of the pasture," he said. "It rises dangerously near the cliff." She met his eyes then, level. "You brought him here." "I do not extend invitation to him," he said. "I extend caution. He arrives where caution lives." Her gaze did not soften. "Then I will not be a place he recognizes." He looked at her fully, as if the description rearranged the room. "You are not like anyone who has lived in this house," he said, not as a compliment but as a report of weather. "Yes," she said. "I noticed the way the walls look at me." "You read their language already." "I am fluent in places that pretend not to be listening," she said. Silence then, but a silence with electricity in it, the sort that stings a little at the fingertips because something that thought itself extinguished has remembered it is a wire and not a string. When the guests had performed their final courtesies and the rector had blessed roads and digestion impartially, the house exhaled. The night took the carriages back into itself. Mrs. Penrose oversaw the antidotes to festivity with the satisfaction of a general reassembling her lines after a successful battle. Elena stood at the foot of the stairs and did not yet ascend. Sebastian lingered in the shadow at the base of a portrait that had always pretended to be more important than the people it hung above. "Lady Blackthorne," he said. Julian was out of line. "He told me Cornwall loves a story," she said. "I told him I am not a story one tells. I am a story one must survive. We will see whether he has the discipline." He absorbed that. "I cannot ask you." He stopped. He seemed to taste the shape of the next words and decide that swallowing them would be more damaging than saying them. "I will not ask you to endure rudeness for the sake of my peace. If you wish to absent yourself when he is here, you shall have my apology and my consent." "And if I wish to be present?" she asked. "Then," he said, "I will thank you and be more watchful than I have been." "Good," she said. "I prefer men who learn." He inclined his head, and for an instant she saw the boy he had once been, a boy who had excelled not because he desired praise, but because the world around him relaxed when he succeeded. He reached as if to touch the baluster and checked. The gesture was so small most people would have missed it. She did not. She stepped to the first stair and then paused. It was an unimportant pause. It contained, nevertheless, a decision. "Your letter," she said. "It defined terms so completely I assumed you must be a man who feared open spaces." He met her stare, and the corner of his mouth answered a thought of his that he did not share. "I fear fire," he said. The sentence was the size of a thumbnail and contained a house. "Then build around stone," she said. "Only do not mistake silence for stone." He said nothing. She climbed. She did not look back. In the days that followed, she carved a pattern for herself that made the house show its shape. Mourning with ledgers, beginning with the small, because that is where men are lazy. The theft of a shilling offends God as much as the theft of a pound, but men are less afraid of hell for the former. Afternoon, she walked rooms with Mrs. Penrose, learning how a house breathes. In the late hours, when servants have become whispers and masters pretend to be thoughts, she read by the library's fire. The ledgers, obedient now, opened. There it was, again and again, the smooth signature whose flourished J might have been a fishhook, pulling coin into pockets whose mouths told no names. She mapped dates upon the wall of her mind and pinned them with the receipts she had discovered. 2 more now, one fallen from a prayer book that had never, she suspected, encountered prayer, and one slid behind the lining of a drawer in the small escritoire that had belonged to a woman who had liked blue ribbon. She began to discover that when she allowed knowledge to sit for a day, it fermented into understanding. The pattern clarified. Money moved when storms moved. A roof paid for when rain made requests and never mended. When sun quit the argument. Labourers fed on paper in towns where the alewives knew every man who swung a hammer and nobody answered to those names. When she mentioned the price of oak to Mr. Hale and observed quietly that the timber merchant in the ledger had sold none to anyone else, he drew in a breath that told her the thrill of witness had not died in him despite years of having to account for the inevitable. "You will need proof," he said, "to hold where men turn slippery, proof that will not drown under noise." "I will need to know where the house keeps its ghosts," she said. He looked toward the west wing and then away from it with the disciplined movement of a soldier who hears a drum he has sworn not to march to again. "Respect," he said. "And truth," she said. "I like houses that can hold both." The west wing remained. It waited the way sealed rooms wait, not passive, but patient. Knowledge is a door. Courage is the key. Grief is the hinge that squeals. Elena understood that to open those doors without losing the house's consent, she would need not only the right questions, but the right weather. Storms are good witnesses, noisy enough to drown useful trespass, and honest enough to tell the truth with water and wind. Storms are obliging in Cornwall. 3 nights after the dinner, the sky lowered its brow and made a sermon of rain. Wind bent itself against the eastern windows until the glass flexed with a protest like prayer. The sea came closer in the dark, the way grief does when everyone else is asleep. Elena rose, wrapped herself in her shawl, and lit the lamp whose flame knew how to obey a cautious hand. She moved soft as an intention through corridors that had learned to recognize her steps. At the doors of the west wing she paused. The iron studs were cold through the kid leather of her glove. She lifted the bar that had been set more out of habit than necessity. The right-hand door, scarred and stained by heat older than her claim to the house, yielded with a sigh that made her throat tighten against a feeling that was not fear. Inside, the air was the sort that remembers. It tasted of char and varnish, of the rot that builds gentle rooms in the cavities flames leave behind. Plaster had dropped in petals. Wallpaper hung in strips that moved a little when the draught dared. Chairs in one chamber lay tipped as if an argument had been interrupted by a shout no one had known how to answer. In another, a harp stood with its strings melted into gruesome black vines. Elena's lamp cupped and released light in small breaths. She walked through rooms that had not learned language for their pain. She did not rush. She let her gaze settle on detail because detail stitches wounds into stories, and stories can be carried farther than wounds. At the far end of a long corridor, she found a room whose walls had once been teal, the color that makes daylight a permission. The paint had blackened in plumes. Smoke had drawn its own language across it. On the wall opposite the cold hearth, a picture had hung. The rectangle where it had been was clean as a gripped hand when the rest of the body is muddy. "Respect," she said aloud to no one, and meant it. But she also meant truth. On the floor beneath the empty space lay, half under a fallen curtain rod, a slip of paper that did not belong to the fire's first night. It had the crispness of something placed later, or of something protected by chance. She knelt, lifted it with care. Ink swam where rain had found it once, long ago. She turned it toward the lamp and read a name that had never been entered in the books so far as she had seen them. Lady Isolde Grafton. Not the signature. Someone else's hand had written it in a delicate, clerkly script, but the name appeared in the middle, a referent, as in, delivered at the order of Lady Isolde Grafton. The item was common enough, music paper and a small quantity of oil for lamps. The date placed it 2 nights before the fire. There was also in another hand she did not recognize a note, "See me, urgent, J." She did not know yet whether the J belonged to the signature she had come to dislike so much it made her mouth thin when she saw it, but the letter was a thread, and she had always been deft at following threads, even when they ran through the dark. She folded the paper, slid it into the pocket sewn low in her skirt, and stood. A sound moved along the corridor behind her. not a ghost's, unless ghosts wear boots and practice the discipline of men who do not want to be surprised by their own footsteps. Elena held the lamp steady. Light does not serve the hand that trembles. When he appeared at the threshold, she was not surprised. She had known the night would bring him. Storms bring men to the places they fear. It is one of their mercies. He stopped at once. The sight of him in that room rearranged time. Rain had wet his hair. The drops clung to the edge of his jaw. He did not step forward at first. His eyes took in the scorched harp, the fallen plaster, the absence on the wall where a portrait had been. His breath altered. It was not an intake of fear. It was a man who has learned to take pain without letting it take him. "You should not be here," he said. He did not command it. He offered it like a warning that respected the person it meant to protect. "I should be where the house keeps its honesty," she said. He looked at the clean rectangle on the wall again. "I moved her," he said. The words pulled up slow from under something heavy. "I thought if I looked at her less, I might think of her more truthfully." Elena said nothing. She lowered the lamp a little, so his face stood less in shadow. He did not flinch. She had half expected he might. A man who lives without touch learns to fear even light. "The ledgers speak," she said softly, "but not the whole tongue. I need both languages." He nodded, once. The movement felt like the groan of a ship turning under a new wind. "Julian came that night," he said. "There was an argument. I was not here. That is the part I cannot teach to be quiet." He turned his hands palm up, as if to show her his guilt, like coins he meant to pay. His gloves were off. She saw the scars she had suspected, and now understood. The kind fire does that teaches a body to remember the hour you thought your life would end. "You went in," she said. "Men who do not intend to love do not walk into fire." She said it calmly, in a voice made for instructions, because pity would have insulted something in him he needed to keep. He breathed, and then noticed that he was breathing as if for the first time in the room. He stepped forward one pace. The wet dark of his coat held the lamplight like a promise not yet decided. "You open doors," he said. He meant not this one, but the kind that is between one person and another when both have lost the map. "You shut them," she said. "Perhaps we make a hinge." A sound like laughter broke out of him and startled both of them. It was not joy. It was the beginning of how joy happens in men who believed it had no business with them any longer. He let his gaze rest briefly on her hand around the lamp's handle. She let it rest on his face, the way you set something back exactly where it belongs. She did not reach out. Neither did he. Some distances are respectful. They cannot be crossed until both souls know the ground that will hold them. They left the wing together without speaking further. The house received them like lungs receiving air after someone has lifted something heavy from the chest. Outside, the storm practiced endurance. In the corridor, a lamp guttered and recovered. They stood for a moment before the doors of the west wing. Elena slid the bar back into place. It made the sound of a conclusion that knows it is only a pause. At the base of the stair, he stopped. "I have been," he said quietly, "a poor host and a worse husband. You deserve more than a roof held up by caution." "I will be satisfied," she said, "with a roof held up by truth." "I do not know if I can give you that," he said simply. "Then we will take it from the house," she replied. It has more than it can carry alone." He looked at her for a time that could have been a second or a prayer. "You will do it anyway," he said, "whether I permitted it or no." "I learned long ago," she said, "not to wait for permissions. A man had to cut out of himself first." He accepted the blow as a gift because it was clean. "Good night, Lady Blackthorn." "Good night, my lord." In her chamber, she laid the scrap with Isolde's name beside her mother's cameo. Two women she did not yet know the shape of, drawn now into the same small circle of light on her table. She touched the cameo. She touched the paper. The wind did as it always had done, and the sea kept its oaths. She slept with the steadiness of someone who has crossed a room she was told to avoid and found it ready to tell her the truth when the weather is right. Morning walked in cautiously. The storm had combed the gardens into disarray. The hedges looked chastised. The gravel wore the tracks of a night full of decisions. Elena rose early, because the proof of courage is not in what you dare at midnight, but in what you attend to at 8 o'clock. She carried the scrap to Mr. Hale and laid it on his desk as though it were bread she meant to share. He read, lifted his eyes, and without comment unlocked a drawer she had not yet seen him use. From it he took an older ledger, worn at the corners and bearing a water stain in the shape of a county. He opened to the year of the fire. There it was, J. An order that matched the note's date, the same merchant who appeared later in the counterfeit roof repairs, a sum greater than cents. And a marginal notation in a different hand. Verify, Isolde. "Who wrote that?" she asked. "Dr. Merrick," he said. "He mended bodies and doubted numbers. A useful man. He knew more than he said." "Bring him," she said. "I will ask him," Mr. Hale corrected, a grammar she welcomed. "People who live in counties do not get brought, they can only be asked." She returned to the library. The portrait she had not seen, the one that had been moved, lived now along the far wall between two windows. Lady Isolde Grafton regarded the room with a face that had expected more from life and tried not to look as if it had. Whoever had restored the canvas from smoke had left faint shadows in the paint at the line of the jaw, as if to remind viewers that beauty is often the last pleasant thing to happen to a person. Elena stood before it a long time. She felt not jealousy, as women are told they must feel for the dead women men survive, but obligation. It is one thing to live after another woman's pain, it is another to leave it where you found it. "Very well," she said. "We will speak for one another. You, when the rooms will listen only to you. I, when the living refuse." She set about work with a ferocity that wore Curtis's face. The school for village children that had existed as a memory in Mrs. Penrose's sentences reappeared in her afternoon's list. Window panes cracked in rooms nobody visited found themselves petitioned for repair. The kitchen received extra flour, and the order that the scullery girls eat at a table instead of beside a bucket. These were small laws. They multiplied like mercy. And through them all she followed the lines of ink that led where light had never been asked to go. At dusk, when the day is tender enough to confess that it is ending, she went out along the cliff path with her cloak tight and her hair pinned with the kind of stubbornness that hair respects. The sea was the colour of resolve. On the lower path she met two children racing a stolen gust of wind. They halted when they saw her, as if authority always materialized dressed in dark velvet and a cameo. "Do you run races here often?" she asked. Only when the cliff means us to win, the boy said, his honesty generous. Then run where the cliff is on your side, she said, and not at the old mine when rain is coming. The girl's eyes widened. We hide there sometimes, she confessed. It's warm if you go under the beam where the wind can't find you. You will tell me when you go, Elena said, and I will tell you stories that make hiding unnecessary. They nodded gravely in the way of children who have made a treaty with a queen in a fable. They ran on. She stood, the wind tugging at the hem of her cloak, and watched the sea throw itself toward the rock, and then, because the world is wiser than it appears, fall back intact. It is possible, she thought, to be strong without breaking, and to be relentless without harm. It is possible to rebuild a house without burning the men who had set it on fire. When she returned, the lamps were lit, and the hall wore the mild golden look that makes evening seem like an idea one might almost trust. Sebastian waited at the foot of the stairs. He had a book in his hand that he had not been reading. She could tell by the way his thumb stayed pressed against the same page, as if time had stopped for that leaf alone. Dr. Merrick will come tomorrow, he said, without preface. Mr. Hale thought... He stopped, corrected himself. I thought you would prefer to see him soon. I do, she said. Thank you. The children run at the cliffs, he said, as if the information needed a second life in speech to be real. They do, she said. I will see to it they have other places to spend their speed. You are making a school. I am making a house, she answered. Schools are rooms in it. He studied her a moment. I thought, he said quietly, that I had married an obligation. You did, she said. You married the obligation I keep to myself. The rest is a good bargain for us both. I do not know what to call what we are making, he admitted. You are a man, she said. You can call it a ledger if you like. I will call it a life. The corner of his mouth tilted, and she understood that humour in him was like a spring that had been found under stones and was not yet ready to show itself to daylight. Good night, he said. Good night, she returned. Her hand brushed the baluster, not to steady herself, to announce quietly to the wood that she belonged to it and it to her. In her room, she wrote to James. She did not tell him anything that would frighten him. She told him the sea here was the colour of thought and the bread honest, that she had met two children who might one day learn to draw the kind of bridges he dreamed about, and that if he ever stood upon one of those bridges he should look down, not in fear, but in respect for the distance he had crossed. She sealed the letter and left it where Mrs. Penrose's trust would find it and make it travel. Sleep came like a guest who no longer needed to be impressed. She did not brace herself against it. She let it take her. Somewhere between eyelids and dream, she felt the house, for the first time, cease resisting her and begin to lean. In the morning, the west wind had turned kinder. The garden wore the storm as jewellery, pearls of water in the hedges, diamonds shaken from the roses. Elena stood in the library with Lady Isolde's painted eyes upon her and sorted receipts by both date and conscience. She heard a step at the door and did not need to look up to know whose it was. I have ordered repairs, Sebastian said, for the roof of the schoolhouse that used to be a stable. It seemed practical. It is the most romantic thing you have said, she replied without turning. And when she did turn, his face declared he understood that sentence for what it was, a truth, not a jest. We will begin to be observed, he said, half rueful, half resigned. People will imagine we like each other. Then let us give them something more difficult, she said. Let us be just. He looked past her shoulder at the portrait. He did not look long. He looked back at her. I would like, he said, then paused as though waiting for permission from the guardian he kept in his chest. I would like to know what you require of me today. Your hands, she said, surprising them both. Not on me, on the work. Sign where I put the proofs. Send for the timber that exists, and dismiss the ghosts that take wages. Stand in the school's doorway while the roof is mended, so that the men on the ladder remember they mend more than wood. He nodded, as if each instruction allowed him to breathe a little farther down into his own lungs. I can do that, he said. I know, she said. He left. She sat, the cameo warm at her throat, and the scrap with Isolde's name warm beside her inkstand. Outside, the wind set the newly washed world in motion. Inside, a woman who had promised not to disappear went to work, making her promise less a vow and more a fact. Dr. Merrick arrived with the smell of salt in his coat and the steadiness of men who have washed their hands at too many basins to be surprised by blood or lies. He was spare as a willow switch and twice as flexible. The sort of physician country people trust because he listens with the same attention to a wrist's pulse and a widow's worry. Mr. Hale ushered him into the steward's office as if presenting an instrument he already knew how to play. Ella Lanena rose from the desk where her fingers had been walking the columns of figures like a woman pacing the deck of a ship, feeling for the swell under the surface. Lady Blackthorne. Dr. Merrick's bow was neat but not courtly. It was the bow of a man who spends his grace on needles and news. You wrote this, she said without preamble, touching the marginal note. Verify, Isolde. I did, he answered. I had a habit of writing questions where other men wrote sums. The house was too full of answers. It made me suspicious. She slid the scrap with Isolde Grafton's name toward him as if passing bread. His eyes altered the way eyes do when the world suddenly aligns with a suspicion you've fed but never named. He did not smile. Julian, he said, and in the single name there was an entire county's patience wearing thin. You know the hand? She asked. I know the habit, he corrected. The merchant's name. Fallow Sons. No fallow within 20 miles owned so much as a ledger, but Julian liked the sound of sons attached to anything he touched. It made theft look like legacy. Elena breathed once, not to calm herself, but to seat her fury where it could sit up straight and be useful. Tell me about Lady Isolde. The doctor's face arranged itself into the past. She was kind in a way that made people feel clever. She had a way of making a room warmer without touching the fire. That night, he stopped, then continued with the care of a man lowering a body into words. A lamp overturned. The maid had been sent away on some errand that made no sense in a storm. The west wing took the flame like a dry throat takes water. By the time the alarm carried, it was already a sermon. His lordship went in and came out twice, once with a girl who worked the laundry, once with nothing but burns for his trouble. Isolde, he swallowed. She was found later. Julian? Elena asked, the name a blade she had sharpened. He was here, Dr. Merrick said. Some quarrel in the afternoon. No one heard the words. People here around gentlemen. The air is loud with them, and no one listens. He placed 2 fingers lightly on the ledger as if taking its pulse. Payments began after. to fallow sons, to roofers who never brought ladders, to labourers who drink without drinking. The sums were irregular enough to be regular. And no one stopped it, Elena said. She did not make it an accusation. It was an anatomy. How does rot travel, bone to bone? Grief makes good cover, the doctor said, and a man who is decent at suffering is difficult to distrust. Mr. Hale asked questions with his eyes. The answers looked back like photographs, flat and plausible. I wrote in margins. The wing was sealed. So was the rest. Not any longer, she said. When Dr. Merrick left, he took with him a copy of the receipt and a promise to ask a fisherman in Porthkelly about a cart that had travelled on a night when no cart should have. Men who should not be on the road are remembered by men who must be on the road, he said at the door. We will find the wheel marks in someone's head. Elena returned to the library. Lady Isolde watched from her restored station. I will not let my questions become a cruelty, Elena told the painted mouth, but I will not let courtesy become a leash. She slipped the cameo's chain through her fingers once, the way a sailor runs a line to test for fray, and went to find Mrs. Penrose. Who sent the maid away? She asked without ceremony. The order came through Mr. Julian, the housekeeper replied, and for the first time her name for him carried no courtesy at all. He said there was a parcel at the gate and needed delicate hands. There was no parcel. The girl returned into smoke. Thank you, Elena said. Mrs. Penrose nodded, a soldier's acknowledgment. No gratitude required. We are in the same war. Word behaves like weather. By late afternoon it had spread inland that the lady at Trigaro had a way of looking at paper that made it speak, and a way of speaking that made men move. A messenger arrived from the schoolmaster with a note written in a hurried, apologetic hand. The roof of the old stable creaked under the day's wind. He feared to hold class if the clouds grew heavy. Close the room, Elena sent back. Open the one with the south windows. I will come with benches. She did not wait for permission from a man whose permission would never be as urgent as a child's safety. Mr. Hale ordered the wagon. Mrs. Penrose marshalled 2 footmen with the efficient ruthlessness that makes kitchens and campaigns alike succeed. They were unloading planks at the schoolhouse when the sky shifted its jaw and decided on rain. And it came straight and stubborn, the rain of a county that keeps old arguments and will not be argued with. Children gathered, their faces bright with interest in the chaos adults pretend to loathe and secretly live for. Elena set her hat harder upon her head and moved her hands as if the planks were numbers that needed to add toward kindness. She had almost forgotten the scrape of wheels that does not belong to a harmless cart when a figure stepped out of the grey with the confidence of a man who believes weather is a subordinate. Julian tipped his hat. The raindrops seemed to avoid him as if charm worked on water. "My dear Lady Blackthorne," he said, surveying the scene as if she had arranged it for his entertainment. "I have never seen a countess carry a bench. What a thrilling novelty." "Do you bring hands or only remarks?" she said, not slowing. "Remarks," he said cheerfully. "Hands leave splinters. Remarks leave legends." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a confidential murmur that tried to smell like violets and smelled like money. "And legends will be needed soon." "For whom?" she asked. "For you," he said, "and for my cousin. You have a talent, my lady. It will be a pity to waste it on little schools and leaky roofs. Come to town with me next month. I will make introductions that do not forget you at the door. You will find better instruments for your abilities than ledgers and lanterns." She looked at him then fully, the way you regard a cliff to know whether it means to hold. "What do you require in return for instruments?" she asked, as if she wished to learn a craft and not a trap. "Only companionship," he said mildly. "A little candour. The truth is malleable, Lady Blackthorn, but not infinitely so. Best to shape it in company." "The truth," she said, "is a stone. It will shape us both sooner than we will shape it." His smile broadened into something sincere and therefore ugly. "Your husband is a stone," he said softly. "Stones sink." He let the rain polish the insult until it shone. "I would not have you tied to that weight when the water rises." She placed the bench on the ground. "You speak of drowning," she said, "and yet you bring no rope, only words." She stepped closer so that he had to see his own face reflected in the wet of her eyes. "You sent a maid away the night of the fire." He did not flinch. He placed a hand over his heart in parody. "I sent for a parcel," he said. "You cannot blame me for the weather or for Isolde's carelessness. You are a sensible woman, Lady Blackthorn. Sensible women do not look for volcanoes in kitchen stoves." She tipped her head as if listening to a kettle and confirmed that it boiled. "You carry your innocence like a clean handkerchief," she said, "useful for waving, less useful for binding wounds." He lifted his hat slightly, a salute or a shield. "I enjoy our conversations," he said. "Let us continue them privately this evening." He named a small folly on the south lawn, an ornamental tower built to make picnics romantic and declarations convenient. 8 o'clock. The rain will keep the square folk indoors. We shall be stars and speak of navigation. He bowed and went, a gull on a gust, all surface and appetite. Mrs. Penrose appeared at Elena's elbow like a conscience with a mop. "If you go," she said, "do not go without a witness." "I never go without one," Elena said, "but sometimes the witness is the weather." She looked at the folly through the rain and saw not a place for trysts, but a stage where men tell lies to see whether they will be believed. As evening drew its shawl, the sea began a low complaint against the cliffs, as if petitioning for a storm's return. Sebastian came into the library with damp at his cuffs. He had been out where roofs talk to men who pay for them. He stood without speech for a time, and then, as though the silence had to be respected before it could be used, he said, "Julian was seen near the old mine this afternoon." "The children hide there," she said. "They told me. I forbade it. That does not always prevent courage with poor judgment." "He has an interest in men where holes in the ground are concerned," Sebastian said. "The sort of interest that ends with other men's backs giving out 15 years sooner than they must." He looked at her hand where it lay upon the desk. "If he asked to meet you, say no." "He did," she said. "I said yes." It was the first time she had watched fear climb his face and take a seat without being refused. "No," he said, and the word was not a command. It was a prayer. "I will go." "He will not tell you what I need to hear," she said. "He does not think you listen, and perhaps you do not. You hear guilt louder than words." He lifted a hand a few inches from his side and let it hover there like a bird that used to know how to fly. "I cannot." "You can," she said, and stepped close enough that the salt smell of his coat rose to meet her. "But you will not, because you think the fire took from you the right to be near danger again. It did not. It left you with the obligation." He closed his eyes the way a man closes them to put his own signature to a sentence. "Take hail," he said, "and take the rain. It will testify." She did not smile. "It always does." The folly rose from the lawn like a joke told by a man with more money than humour. Its mock battlements looked delicate under the rain, ornamented like a lady's comb. Ella Nena walked there with Mr. Hale at her shoulder, not hiding so much as blending with the evening. When she stepped into the low arch, Julian was already within, leaning against the stone as if it had been put there to hold him up so he would not learn the art of standing on his own. "You came," he said, pleased. "I feared decency might kidnap you and keep you home." "Decency does not patrol my movements," she said. "Conscience does." "Ah," he said, "a stern chaperone." He gestured to the little stone bench. "Sit. Let us be civilized." "I prefer to be true," she answered, remaining on her feet. He shrugged. "Truth is a flavor. I like cinnamon in mine." He stepped nearer. Rain ran in thin threads from his hair. He was handsome in the way of men who have never been told that they are not. "We can be friends, Lady Blackthorn. Not allies, that is so tiresome. Friends. I can fix your brother's position. I can place your name into rooms where it will echo pleasantly. I can unmake rumour with the same speed your husband makes it by doing nothing." "And the price?" she asked for the second time that day, a merchant careful with her coin. "A little paper," he said softly. "A little delay in your inquiries. A little discretion. Your hands on planks are charming. But your hands on pens are dangerous, and we mustn't have you hurting yourself. Leave the sums to men who understand appetite." "And the fire," she said. He tilted his head. "A lamentable accident." "The maid you sent away?" "A misunderstanding." "Isolde?" She did not adorn the name. She placed it between them like a candle, steady, so that either of them might see what it lit. "She was unhappy," Julian said. "Unhappiness seeks its own climate. Some storms are private." He smiled with pity. "Do not drag her ghost into a court. Let the poor woman keep what peace the grave provides." "Peace," Elena said, "is not built out of other people's silence." She stepped closer so that he could see the small scars at the base of her fingers he'd missed the night of the dinner. "You will return the money you have taken," she said, "to the last shilling. You will remove your hand from every lever in the parish. You will not come to Trigero except when summoned. And you will do this not because I ask it." She leaned in, her voice a whisper. The rain had to strain to overhear. "But because the county will know." He laughed, surprised into it. "Who will tell them? You, a woman from nowhere, the steward who has been called careful more often than clever, the doctor who writes in margins, or will you ask the wind to carry your proclamations?" "Yes," she said, "I will." "Very well," he answered, taking her acquiescence for surrender. "Then the wind and I shall compete. Let us see who speaks cleaner to Cornwall." He stepped backward into the arch's shadow. It should have been a retreat. It was the beginning of speed. Before Mr. Hale could move, before Elena could pivot, Julian was out in the rain and running as men run, who have learned that the law loves witnesses more than it loves justice. He fled not to the road, but along the hedge toward the low path that curved toward the old mine. "Hail," Elelena said. The steward was already moving, not fast, but with a steady economy that covers ground, while other men tire themselves with gallantry. She followed, because the body follows a vow more readily than it follows fear. Wind slammed her skirts against her legs. The rain made a curtain, and she passed through it, counting her steps the way you count truth, one and another, until the distance is no longer a number, but a place you have arrived. The mine mouth was a black sentence in the hillside, punctuation left by men who take from the earth and wonder why it is poor company. A lamp moved within, a will-o'-the-wisp improvising law. "Children," Elelena said, and the word was not a cry. It was a command given to the world to hold still. She thought of the girl's eyes, wide and honest, of the boy who believed the cliff sometimes wished them to win. She went in without waiting for any man to tell her that courage had an order of procession. Mr. Hale swore with the piety of a church that knows God's name and followed. The air inside was the kind that turns breath into work. The beam the girl had described stood like a tired giant, carrying too much and unwilling to complain. Water lipped at the floor, finding ankles, encouraging care. "Stay by the wall," Mr. Hale said. "The floor sometimes forgets where it is." They found the first child by the sound of teeth clicking because fear had borrowed his jaw. Elelena knelt in mud as if it were velvet, put her hands to the boy's face, and gave him the one thing the night was not offering, something steady. "We will not run," she said. "We will walk. We will walk as if the floor respects us, and it will." The beam groaned. Mr. Hale swore again, quieter, like an apology. The second child huddled farther in, under the lip of rock where men had once eaten bread and told each other lies about safety. Elelena put one child's hand into the other's, and the other into hers. "Now," she said, and they moved. Julian's lamp flashed ahead and then out. He had gone deeper, thinking perhaps that the dark could be persuaded to choose sides. The floor made a sound humans do not make when they are pleased. Earth shifted. Stone remembered gravity. The beam protested and then failed. She did not think. She lived. She shoved both children toward daylight with a force that would bruise and be forgiven. She put her shoulder where a man would have placed the shoulder of a god if he could have borrowed one. The weight was not tolerable, and therefore it had to be tolerated. Mud climbed, the lamp died, sound became a world. There was a moment when the mine and her body were indistinguishable, everything pressure, everything will. Arms closed around her from behind, human, strong, not Julian. "Leave it," Sebastian's voice said, and in the command there was grief and training, and a life's worth of refusal, learning how to choose. He lifted her, hard, and the beam came down where her skull had been, as if the house had sent its worst discipline to remind her that even courage must sometimes be clever. They stumbled together, his chest at her back, his breath a bellows, his hands uncompromising. The children's cries changed register, the sound of fear finding a future. Outside, the rain had changed from straight to slant. Mr. Hale had one child under each arm, like a man lifting bread from an oven. He looked at Sebastian and did not say thank you. He said, "Good," which is how you speak to a man who has done what he was always meant to do. But the mine was not done with them. From within came a cry that did not belong to a child. Julian's voice, higher than civility had allowed it to be, tore itself upon the edges of the word, help. Elena turned. Sebastian's hand closed on her arm. "No," he said. "Yes," she said. "The county will ask what we did when even he called." She took the lamp Mr. Hale had rescued and shoved it toward Sebastian. "You hate fire," she said. "Then take light. I will take the weight." They went in together. The mine accepted them, the way a difficult truth accepts an honest question, with reluctance and relief. They found Julian waist-deep in a slurry of clay and water, his leg trapped where a sill had shifted. He was no longer handsome. Terror removes all finishing. He looked up at Sebastian and began to weep with rage. "You will let me die," he said. "I always knew." Sebastian set the lamp upon a rock and moved as a man moves when he has learned more than once what arms are for. He braced his back under the timbers, put his hands where leverage allows miracles, and said, "Nell." The name was soft and absolute. It did not ask. It trusted. Elena slid into the mud that meant to own Julian and took hold of his trapped leg. "On my count," she said, "and you will not kick me, or I will leave you. You will do exactly as I say. You will save yourself when a woman tells you how." He obeyed. Men do when death has humbled them into wisdom. Sebastian lifted. Elena twisted. Julian screamed. The beam thought about mercy, and for once in its life practiced it. The leg came free. The mud tried to keep what it had been promised. Elena wrenched him toward her by his jacket, as if pulling clothes from a body she had paid for and refused to waste. They reached daylight, not triumphantly, but adequately, which is how salvation most often happens. The rain washed their faces clean enough to recognize themselves. Julian lay on the grass and became human again, which is to say, capable of shame and of lies in equal measure. He stared at the sky as if it had betrayed him. "I would have died," he said, amazed. "Yes," Elena said, "and you did not." He rolled onto his side and retched up the mine. When he had finished, he turned his head toward her with a hatred so pure it had a kind of beauty. "You will regret this," he whispered. "You are already regrettable," she answered, and stood because standing is how dignity dries. The children were crying in the honest way that allows lungs to clear. Mr. Hale was telling them a ridiculous story about a steward who once kept bees that refused to sting anyone who brought them new words. Dr. Merrick arrived at a run with his bag, his hat crushed under his coat, the rain indifferent to his neatness. He looked at the assembled, took in the mud, the water, the lamp, the wickedness newly spared, and said, "Well, we shall need broth." Back at Trigero, servants became a net that held what had almost fallen. Towels, fire, dry stockings, a clean shirt appearing for a man who had not asked for it because someone who had loved him once had taught the house to know his silences. Sebastian stood in the hallway under the portrait of a man who looked like him and did not resemble him at all, and let Mrs. Penrose and an under-footman fuss at his sleeves. His hands shook. He allowed it. He did not hide it as he would have once. He let trembling be the language of a body that had done what it must. Elena came down the corridor in a loaned dress that smelled faintly of lavender from a drawer that had not been opened since the year grief moved in. She had washed her hair quickly and pinned it in a form that admitted haste without apologizing for it. When she reached him, they did not speak. He looked at her hands. She looked at his eyes. Both saw the same thing. Proof. "You called me Nell," she said at last, not accusing. "It is your name," he said. "It is my brother's," she answered. "And yours, when you are about to lift a house off the people under it," he said, a line that was too exact to be charm. She did not smile. She let the truth rest between them like a warm stone shared by cold hands. "Julian will not be grateful," she said. "Gratitude would be a waste upon him," Sebastian said. "I will prefer his fear." "We will not threaten him," she said. "We do not need to," he answered. "We will simply turn on the lamps and allow the parish to read." Dr. Merrick's report was brisk. The children would carry bruises they could show off like medals. Julian would limp, which might satisfy the county's crude appetite for balance. "He will live," the doctor said, in the tone of a man who has had to be the messenger of worse tidings and would take this one as a mercy if he could. When the house settled, when the last wet boot had been placed in a line that convinced Mrs. Penrose that civilization could be reassembled after any weather, Elena found herself in the small sitting room off the library where the fire is honest because no one expects it to impress. Sebastian came to the threshold, not crossing it at once. He had that look again. The look of a man who has remembered a door and is asking it for permission to be what it opens into. "You could have died," he said, the sentence simple because he intended it to carry all the weight without assistance. "So could you," she returned. "Yes," he said. "I meant to, once. It appears I am weak." He lifted his hand, lowered it, and lifted it again as if it weighed more than it used to. "You should have left him. He would have left you." "I am not him," she said. "I know," he answered. "That is why I followed you." She looked at the fire. It was only flame. She had feared and loved bigger ones. "The house is on our side," she said. "It is," he agreed. "And even the mine has confessed. Cornwall will do the rest. It likes to carry gossip. It will manage truth if we make it light enough to lift." "I have proof," she said, touching the pocket where paper waited like a trained witness. "Receipts, the doctor, Hale's ledgers, the children who will tell their grandchildren that once the cliff itself stood up to listen." "And I," he said. "You have me." She turned then, and her face did something it had not allowed itself to do since London. A softness that was not surrender, but recognition. "I will write the letters," she said. "And I will sign them," he answered. "And I will stand at the school roof," she said. "And I will hold the ladder," he answered. "And when Julian returns with new words," she said, "we will give him fewer places to set them down," he finished. They sat without speaking for a while. Two people who had passed through a narrow place together and discovered the country on the other side had been waiting for them all along. Outside, the sea practiced being endless, and the wind practiced being honest. Somewhere, a child explained to a sibling that bravery was mostly walking at the right speed when the floor might not hold. Somewhere, Mrs. Penrose folded a towel the way you fold a flag after a battle has ended cleanly. Somewhere, Mr. Hale sharpened a pencil like a man whetting a blade. Elena slept that night with mud still under one nail, deliberately left there as a private relic. In the dawn, before the house had entirely believed in mourning, she rose and walked alone to the edge of the west wing. She placed her palm flat upon the scarred door, as one might place a hand on a friend's shoulder. "We did not steal your grief," she said aloud. "We asked it to help us. Thank you." When she turned, Sebastian stood across the hall, not eavesdropping, simply present. He lifted his hand in an unembarrassed acknowledgment of the conversation he had not heard. She crossed to him and stopped at the distance that had become an agreement. His eyes were clear, the way a sky is clear after rain has done the hard part. "We will not disappear," he said. "No," she replied, and let the word belong to both of them. "Now we begin to be seen." Morning arrived in a quieter register, as if the county itself had decided to speak low so the house could hear. The sea was all iron and pewter, hammered flat by light. Elena woke with purpose, already standing in the room, waiting. She dressed for work rather than for impression. A sober gown, the cameo at her throat, cuffs turned back a fraction to free her hands. In the mirror, she saw a woman who had gone into the dark and come back out, bringing with her not trophies, but names. Letters first. She wrote in a hand that made the truth legible, even to men who preferred it blurred, to the magistrate, to the rector who loved forms, to Sir Perrott, whose sheep needed better fences, but whose sense of fairness held, to the schoolmaster, whose ink blotted when he felt things, to the timber yard in St. Austell with whom she had already spoken, to 3 wives whose backs knew the weight of their husbands' choices. She did not plead. She documented. She did the arithmetic of harm and set it beside the inventory of what could be mended. When she laid each page for sand to dry the ink, the words looked back at her without flinching. Sebastian came as she sealed the last envelope with wax and a signet that had once meant merely property and now, she intended, would mean stewardship. He did not ask to read them. He asked where to sign. She indicated the places. He put his name down with the steadiness of a man rediscovering what a signature is for. When he finished, he did not step away at once. "Isolde," he said, the name steady, not dragged. "I will not make of her a cudgel," Elena said, "nor of her a saint. We will give her what this house owes its dead, truth and a room that is not sealed." He nodded. "When the wing reopens, it will not be to staring. It will be to work and to song. Then build a room where children practice scales on an instrument with new strings," she said, thinking of the harp with its melted vines. "Let the house learn to hear music again." He looked at her with a caution that had shed fear but not respect. "Tell me what to do today." "See Dr. Merrick," she said. "Ask him to send word to the men he trusts most among the miners. We will make a rule of lanterns and beams that do not pretend to be younger than they are. Then go to the schoolhouse roof and stand there until the last nail goes in. You will not speak. You will simply be seen." "I can do that," he said, and she heard in the sentence not obedience but partnership. Mr. Hale took the letters to his safest boy and dispatched him with the gravity of a general granting the field to a courier who knows how not to boast. Mrs. Penrose came to the threshold and asked no questions. She merely set down a tray where the cup steamed and the bread's crust had been cut so that the first bite would not resist. "You will want starch if you mean to carry the county on your back," she said. "I do not intend to carry it alone," Elena answered. "I intend to remind it of its legs." By noon, the county had begun to move. The magistrate, who always looked faintly apologetic for the law, as though he were wearing an ill-fitting coat at a wedding, sent back a note that had courage tucked between its clauses. He would convene an inquiry. In the meantime, he desired to review any documents the house might provide. Sir Perrow replied with bluster that consented to cooperation, which is as much as one can hope for from men who protect their pride as if it were harvest. The rector expressed shock in curlicues and a wish to pray over accounts. Elillanena sent him the ledger that had made Mr. Hale swear softly and told him he was welcome to bless the sums into righteousness if his God obliged him. Rumour, which hates paperwork, hurried ahead of the letters anyway. It travelled on boots and baskets and under aprons. It went into the alehouse and came out sober and then drunk again. It sat on barrels. It perched on fence rails between fields. It made a nest in the hair of a girl who talked quick while she braided her sisters. By sundown, it had learned to pronounce all the names and to place each at the correct angle to guilt. It discovered that Julian had limped home carried by two men who made jokes they did not feel. It discovered that a steward had lifted children under his arms like loaves, and that a lady had mud to her knees and had not apologized for it. Julian did not appear at Trigero. He sent a note addressed to Sebastian and written by a hand that was not his. Too careful, too correct, the flavour of a clerk. It protested gratitude. It hinted at injury. It asked for time, which is the thing men always ask for when they have spent it wrongly. Sebastian left the note on the library desk without touching it twice. Elillanena read it once, and then placed it under the weight of the law book the receipt had fallen from, as if to teach it the feel of consequences. The inquiry met in the long room at the inn 2 days later, because the courthouse was being painted, and the law has always been willing to borrow a table when it must. Men sat who preferred to stand. Others stood who wished to sit. Everyone arranged their mouths to look independent and their eyes to be instructed. Dr. Merrick spoke first, not because rank required it, but because the room preferred to get clean news before it had to swallow dirty news. He told what he knew in sentences that kept their feet. Mr. Hale followed with figures that added even for people who dislike the kind of arithmetic that takes food out of the mouths of thieves. When the magistrate asked whether the pattern could be coincidence, Hale looked at him with the slow patience of a farmer answering a man who has never yet planted, and said, "A coincidence that repeats itself upon gain is called a habit." Elillanena spoke last among those on her side. She did not speak long. She laid the receipts out one by one, as if dressing a wound that had to be aired before it could be bound. She named the children without spectacle and the beam without rage. She named Isolde without apology, and then sat down. Julian's man, he was not lawyer enough to deserve the title, made a show of shuffling paper and looking for a phrase to hide behind. He called the receipts fabrications. He called the signatures forgeries. He called grief a fog through which no man should be expected to find the right door. He called Elillanena unseasoned and Sebastian unwell. The room shifted on its feet and did not like the sound of its own movement. When he called Mr. Hale envious, the steward lifted a palm in a gesture that did not request attention but received it anyway, and said, "Sir, I have envied men their good boots and their daughters' husbands. I have not yet envied a thief his hunger." The door at the back opened then, and the kind of witness entered that clears rumour like a gust does smoke. The fisherman from Porthkelly, hat in both hands, salt in his eyebrows, told plainly of a cart that should not have run the night the wing burned. He had helped the horse where the wheels slipped, and had been paid in coin too bright for the errand. It had a barrel with no smell, he said. If a barrel from a farm doesn't smell, you ask what liquid it used to carry. If the man holding the reins won't answer, you ask yourself whether you like the kind of silence you are buying. Whose man was he? The magistrate asked. The man who called himself Fallow, the fisherman said, but couldn't tell you which field his father worked. The room made that sound people make when realizing a story they enjoy is also real enough to hurt. Some faces softened toward Sebastian, some hardened toward Julian. A few did both, which is how complicated truth sits in a county. Judgment did not come that day. The magistrate was careful with balance, slow with conclusion. But something more vital than judgment happened in the minds of people who had come to be convinced. They rearranged their explanations. They made new shelves for the facts. They allowed gratitude to travel in Sebastian's direction instead of pity, which is gratitude's small and useless cousin. In the days that followed, the work thickened. The schoolhouse roof accepted nails as if they were being taught courtesy. The kitchen's laughter changed key, less brittle, more round. The children came to the hall every afternoon with their hands clean and their eyes bright, and sat on benches while a woman from the village with sweet patience taught them letters. Elena sat among them sometimes, mending the torn corner of a ledger, while a boy read aloud about a sailor who mistook the moon for a lamp hung by God over the sea. He was wrong, the boy concluded proudly, but he was not foolish. Most error is not foolish, she said. It is merely lonely. Sebastian was present in ways that admitted both visibility and humility. He stood in thresholds. He carried planks without speaking of it later. He walked the cliff path and learned the names of every child mad enough to race the wind, and then learned the names of their mothers, which is the more difficult scholarship. When he entered rooms, conversation flinched less. When he left them, hope did not. The West Wing reopened in stages. Mrs. Penrose orchestrated the cleaning with a tact that understood the difference between erasing and tending. Smoke was coaxed from plaster. Floors were persuaded to shine. In the teal room, where the portrait's absence had been a shout, Elena supervised the hanging of a new thing. A long strip of blank staff paper framed simply, the kind on which music waits. She placed a tuned pianoforte in the corner, with a soundboard that promised honesty. The first time a child practiced scales there, the house listened without flinching. The second time, it hummed. They marked Isolde's anniversary with a gathering that refused pageant. The rector, whose sermons usually swelled like a sail and forgot the direction of the wind, stood and said only that grief unshared makes cowards of houses, and then sat Doctor. Merrick read 2 sentences from a letter Isolde had once written to a girl whose baby would not live. You will hear the gratitude of your hands before you hear the thanks of your heart. Trust the hands for a while. Elena lit a lamp rather than a candle, and carried it into the West Wing and set it on a shelf where it would remind the house that flame is not enemy by law, only by negligence. Julian avoided the parish roads for a time. When he returned, it was with a limp and a story about heroism in a mine that no one interrupted him from telling, because it is unkind to deprive a man of the narrative that keeps him from hating his own face. He discovered, gradually and with amazement, that invitations no longer arrived with his name written first. He found that when he spoke in the inn, An old man at the end of the bench began polishing his tankard with a cloth in precisely the way one does when waiting for a lie to stop doing what it does. He learned that discounts at the timber yard do not survive ledgers, and that a cousin's patience can outlast a scandal when the cousin is done using caution as his excuse. He attempted once more to enter Trigero without being summoned. Mrs. Penrose met him at the door with a dignity that outmeasured his debts. "As per his lordship's instruction," she said, holding the doorway the way a soldier holds a pass. "Family visits must be requested in writing in advance. The house respects the written word." "The house," he sneered, "respects whatever the lady tells it to." "The house," she said, with a gentleness that would dent steel, "has learned to tell itself the truth." She shut the door as if concluding a sentence. Season turned. Spring came like an apology that meant it. Lambs practiced being foolish. The hedges burst into green so sudden it felt like a rumour proven. At the school, the children discovered that ink stains are proofs of learning and wore them proudly. In the West Wing, music shook dust from rafters it had not met and asked light to join. In the village, the ale was as indifferent as ever to men's reputations, but the talk held fewer knives. In the library, Elena drafted a plan for the mine that was not philanthropy but arithmetic. Safer beams cost less than funerals. Children with books cost less than husbands who drink because the earth took a friend. Clean water in the cottages costs less than mending the fever that follows filth. Sebastian read it and signed without urging, and when he placed his seal, he did it with the satisfaction of a man setting something heavy exactly where it should have been all along. Word went to the magistrate, who found a statute he had overlooked and was grateful to it for existing. There were quieter alterations too, the kind that never make a ledger but change a life every day. Tom the footman laughed without looking toward the door first. The scullery girl who had dropped her spoon that first morning now dropped it only when she wanted to see if Elena would pick it up with the same deliberate lack of condescension. In time, she stopped dropping it altogether. Mr. Hale planted beans in a strip of earth along the south wall and inspected them with his arms folded whenever sums had made him forget that growth is one of the few variables that repays attention with more of itself. Mrs. Penrose lifted the ban on singing in the laundry on Wednesdays because songs turn heavy wet cloths into something like tolerable weather. Elena and Sebastian learned a choreography without the humiliation of lessons. They could pass one another in a doorway and exchange more than courtesy without anyone seeing the exchange. They could sit at opposite ends of the same long table and finish one another's work by omission, she leaving a question where his silence would be understood as assent, he leaving a signature where her courage had cleared a path. Sometimes, rarely, they stood within the length of a hand and did not reach. It was not abstention, but attention, a choice to honor a heat that had been won in a house that once knew only ash. When desire finally asked for its own room, it did not come like a storm. It came like a hearth being laid with proper wood after a long winter of burning anything at hand. It happened on a day of completion rather than beginning, the day the school's new roof held its first rain without complaint, the day the West Wing's rooms carried the weight of living feet without whispering of fire. They walked the cliff path together with a basket between them, and in the basket lay nothing grander than bread, cheese, 2 pears, and a packet of letters that had been answered with good news. The wind did not shove. It suggested. The sea did not roar. It approved. They sat where the rock makes a bench for the kind of people who do not mind leaving a seat polished for others. Elelena leaned back on her hands and tipped her face to the pale sun. Sebastian watched her, and did not feel the old fear, the one that says light is a promise it cannot keep. He reached across the space between them and touched the cameo as if to ask permission of the woman who had worn it before and of the girl who had given it a new name. Elelena did not close her eyes. She was done with rituals of surrender that pretend to be romance. She placed her hand over his and moved it gently from the cameo to the skin just above, where her pulse spoke for her. He listened with his fingers. He bent. The kiss they made was not apology and not conquest. It was agreement. After, they spoke of practicalities, because practicalities are how you respect the sacred when you mean to keep it. "Rooms," she said. "We will need to reassign 2 in the West Wing for the music mistress who will grow the children's hands. And a workshop," he said, "for the men who will make frames for windows that do not rattle." "And a stipend," she said, "for the mothers who come to learn their letters beside their daughters." "And a bench," he said, looking at the rock with the contentment of a man who had never before believed a bench could be a destination and not an interruption. "Here." They returned to the house and found that news can travel more quickly than feet. The servants did not look at them differently, which is how one recognizes devotion. Mrs. Penrose's mouth failed to keep from being pleased. Mr. Hale inspected the sky and declared it serviceable for work. The children, who always know first, took their discovery outside and ran it until it turned into laughter. The magistrate wrote 3 weeks later with a conclusion that did not satisfy the appetite for spectacle, but did right by the facts. Julian would repay the sums, with interest, on a schedule that would teach him the discipline of honesty 1 shilling at a time. He would sell a portion of his land to make the schedule possible. He would not hold office for a decade. He would attend, once a quarter, the school at Trigaro to hear the children read out loud, and he would stand while they did it. The law has so few opportunities to humiliate wickedness into wisdom that the magistrate took what he could. Julian sent no letter of complaint. He sent, by a boy with dirty knees and clear eyes, a small parcel addressed to Elelena. Inside lay a handkerchief of fine linen, unstained, with initials embroidered in a woman's script that belonged to no one still breathing. There was no note. Elelena folded it, placed it among the papers in the drawer under the cameo, and said aloud to nobody, "You are seen." She did not know whether she meant Isolde or the part of Julian he had not yet learned to hate. Perhaps both. Mercy can hold more than one object at a time if you do not force it to be symmetrical. On a morning when the sea wore silk instead of mail, they opened the last door in the West Wing. The room had once held a nursery. Its wallpaper had been printed with foxes and ferns that now wandered under the char. Elelena had kept this room for last because she understood the instrument of sequence. The order in which you do things teaches the house what lesson it is learning. She stood in the doorway with Sebastian behind her. She stepped in and waited to hear whether the floor complained. It did not. The light entered like a guest who had been overdue so long that the family had forgotten its name. She touched the sill. The wood was not original. It did not need to be. "Here," she said, "we will place a long table. Children will spill paint. Women will cut cloth. Men will build toys they pretend are for their sons. People will begin here and go elsewhere better. Sebastian set his hand beside hers. And here, he said, tapping the lintel, we will write a rule. Any heart that comes into this room must leave heavier with joy than with anything else. She smiled then, not the small smile she had allowed as currency among strangers, but the large one that changes the color of a day. You have learned to make laws, she said. I have learned to listen to the ones that already existed, he answered. You placed them in my hearing. Summer arrived, and with it the harvest of ordinary goodness. The school held a reading where children stood on tiptoe to make their voices taller and read passages about rivers and kings and the rights of citizens. Sebastian stood in the doorway, as ordered, and became the kind of pillar whose strength is visible because it is used. Elena sat with the mothers, passing babies down the bench so each woman could clap. Mr. Hale, believing himself unnoticed, wiped his eyes. Mrs. Penrose did not. She saved the tears for her pantry, where nobody could accuse her of softness. There were days of setback, because houses and hearts do not move only in one direction. A roof tile slipped and must be set again. A ledger miswrote itself and had to be corrected. A child fell ill, and the fear that love's contagion moved through the servants like a rumour until Dr. Merrick brought his quiet and his bitter tea. Once, a gale took a section of the kitchen garden fence and scattered the peas into a future they had not planned for. Elena stood in the rain with her hair undone, laughing not at the ruin, but at the way chance insists on participating in our plans. Very well, she told the weather. Come and be counted. We will plant again. And they did. The peas forgave. In autumn, when the hedges reddened and the air tasted of apples and iron, Sebastian asked a question without ceremony in a room that had once been sealed. He had no ring in his hand. He did not kneel. He did not require witnesses. He said only, "Will you choose this with me each day?" And Elena, who had been choosing it for months, said yes. And the house, which had learned by then how to celebrate without smoke, took a breath so content that the lamps brightened. They married the way sensible people marry who have already placed the heavy furniture, with bread, with signatures, with neighbours who brought crooked smiles and straight blessing, with music that had learned to live in the West Wing. The rector's words were simple and good. The children threw petals and then retrieved them to throw again. Mr. Hale toasted with ale and arithmetic. Mrs. Penrose pretended to disapprove of the crumbs on the carpet, and then did not sweep them until morning, because some messes are proof of joy. Dr. Merrick stood with his hands behind him and his eyes on the couple, the way a man watches a recovery he thought at first would never occur. When night came, it did not arrive to demand old proofs. It came as a friend who had earned the right to sit near the fire and say nothing. They went together to the room that had been hers and would remain so even while it was theirs, because marriage is not a swallowing, but a joining. She placed the cameo in a dish beside her mother's handkerchief and Isolde's name and the first receipt she had found, not as trophies, not as relics, but as part of the ledger she kept of the life she had promised herself. He stood behind her and did not touch until he felt the air consent, and then he did, and the touch was both blessing and question, answered and asked again through the night in the language that requires no letters. Winter returned and found nothing to do but draw its clean lines. The school's fire burned, the mine's lamps were honest, the books balanced, The music teacher took tea in a room where once ash pretended to be snow. The county learned, slowly and with its usual reluctance, to prefer truth because it is cheaper to maintain. Julian paid. He paid in coin, and in the time he spent listening to children sound out words that locked doors against the kind of lies he had liked best. He limped less, but nobody mistook that for healing. Once, after a reading, he lifted his eyes and found Elena watching him, with a gaze that contained neither triumph nor malice. It unsettled him. He went home early and did not stop at the inn. People noticed without remarking, which is how mercy is kept warm in a place that still needs it. They made a practice in that year and the ones that followed of standing at the cliff at least once a week. Some weeks the wind presented itself as argument. Some weeks it offered a psalm. They learned to tell the weather by one another's faces and to bring it inside and set it down like a coat. They argued about small things and turned them into laughter before supper. They argued about larger ones and turned them into plans by morning. They allowed the house to correct them when it knew better, which it often did. They allowed the village to belong to itself and not to their vanity, which was harder than it sounds and more rewarding than it looks. In time, James came, taller and full of questions. He stood on the cliff Elena had described to him in letters and shouted his joy into the wind like a boy who has found that the world does not break when it hears him. He watched Sebastian with the interest of a brother who was not in need of a father and learned a new word, ally, that grows better in the mouth than most. He spent afternoons in Mr. Hale's office discovering the colour of columns and evenings in the West Wing, turning scales into tunes. He loved the house not for its size, but for the way it behaved. "It is honest," he said, and Mrs. Penrose, passing with a basket of linen, said, "As are you, if you wash your hands." And James laughed and did as he was told, because he had learned to respect the kind of order that does not humiliate. Years do what they do. Children grew into readers and then into makers. A girl who had once hidden under a beam in a bad mine became the village's midwife and named her daughter Isolde without making a saint of the name. A boy who had run races with the wind returned from an apprenticeship with a talent for building windows that do not rattle, and married the scullery girl, who no longer dropped spoons, and they put a bench under the south wall where beans once grew, and taught their own son to count clouds as practice for counting coins. Dr. Merrick went greyer at the temples and kinder at the mouth. The rector learned to shorten his sermons by a quarter and to sing the long hymns slower. Sir Perro fenced his sheep honourably. The magistrate slept. Trigaro kept its promise. It did not become a temple or a courthouse or a monument. It became, which is harder, a home where work and mercy made a practice of each other. Sometimes, on evenings when the lamps lined up like patient stars, and the sea laid down its sword, music from the West Wing drifted across the lawn and into the folly. Once, standing there, Elena remembered the night rain had slicked those stones and a man had offered cinnamon for truth. She put her hand flat against the arch and said not unkindly, "You were the last room we learned how not to use," and she walked back to the house with her steps light enough to make the gravel pleased. If you asked the county years later what had changed at Trigaro, it would tell you, in the language counties prefer, examples and stories rather than theses. It would say, there was a day a lady carried a bench under rain and never put it down again, and that a man who had been honest in his suffering learned to be honest in his living, and that once a mine tried to take 3 lives and failed because 2 people refused to let the floor decide who stands. It would say the West Wing sings now. It would say children read their names out loud so they belong to themselves. It would say bread tastes better when accounts do not lie. It would say the sea still throws itself at the cliffs and loses and returns, and that this is not defeat but practice. And if you asked the house, if you could, in the way of tales, press your ear to its lintel and hear the language of beams, it would tell you that a woman came with a cameo and a vow, and a man met her with a wound and a door, and between them they made a hinge sturdy enough to move everything that had thought itself stuck. It would tell you that the ice did not merely melt, it bloomed.